Well, good morning, and welcome to the Middle East Institute. I'm Wendy Chamberlain. I'm president of the Middle East Institute. I see some new faces and some old faces. For those new faces, we'd like to invite you to become a member on your way out. And for those old faces and long-term supporters of the Middle East Institute, we thank you for your support. Because in these times of sequestration and everything else, your support becomes all the more valuable, and we are deeply appreciative. The Middle East Institute, the American Friends for UNRWA, and the Foundation for Near East Peace, we're really honored today to host the Honorable Filippo Grandi, Commissioner-General of UNRWA. Filippo will discuss one of the most compelling and, in my view, underreported humanitarian situations in the world, and that is the plight of Palestinian refugees among the Syrian refugees. UNRWA was established in 1949, and it was established with a mission to provide services to the estimated now 5 million Palestinian refugees that are registered in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, and Gaza. During normal times, UNRWA has a tough and very much underfunded assignment. So again, a pitch to contributors to UNRWA. Today there's growing attention now on the estimated or soon to be 1 million refugees from Syria that have fled the conflict there. Mr. Grandi will talk to us today about the Palestinians among them and the very unique plight that they face that, as I said before, I believe is underreported. You know, having worked for 3 years at the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency in Geneva, I have great respect for the mission and the work of UNRWA, which is separate from what UNHCR does. And because I know him personally, and I know his professional history, his achievements, and his victories, I regard Filippo Grandi as one of those exceptional international heroes. Before Filippo joined the leadership position in UNRWA 8 years ago in 2005, he had a distinguished career at UNHCR, where I first came to know him. And for the past almost 3 decades, if there was a humanitarian disaster, if there was a dangerous conflict, Filippo was there. He'd fight to go there. He'd fight to get that assignment and put himself at peril. He served most recently, before coming to UNRWA, in Afghanistan. And before that, he had a series of risky assignments, including the Sudan, Great Lakes crisis in Central Africa, particularly in Goma. He served the underserved in Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Yemen, Kenya, Benin, Ghana, Liberia, and I probably missed some other crisis areas. But anyway, join me in welcoming Filippo Grandi.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Wendy. I actually met you when you were ambassador in Pakistan, talking of frontline assignments. Yeah. So nice to meet you all, and my thanks also go to the institutions that have invited us here today, the Middle East Institute, Foundation for Near East Peace, and last but not least, the American Friends of UNRWA, headed by Phil Wilcox, and our main allies here in the United States and supporters. I'm here in Washington on what I would call a regular visit. I come about twice a year to talk about UNRWA and about Palestinian refugees. And you know, every time I come, I'm told that this is not a priority. And I guess there's always something else that is more important than Palestinian refugees or UNRWA. Certainly you have a lot of budgetary discussions, which, however, affect us as well, and we'll consider that in a moment. But what is interesting in a more, how can I say, strategic interest point of view is that the biggest competitor for attention and possibly resources to the question of Palestinian refugees today is probably Syria and the crisis in Syria, which is monopolizing political attention, funding, humanitarian funding, and so forth. Now, it's interesting because, of course, one of the things that I'm saying here in Washington, and I've been saying around the world in the past few months, is that, sure, Syria is very important, but don't forget that actually Syria contains a Palestinian element, which is very, very important. And therefore, attention to Syria needs to be given in a manner that is sophisticated enough not to forget that the Palestinian refugee element in the crisis is extremely sensitive and extremely important. Before I go to that, though, let me stress one point that Wendy mentioned, but I want to amplify it a bit. UNRWA is really an organization that has been created and continues to be existing to provide opportunities to a population which is now of almost 5 million people, the registered Palestinian refugees in the Middle East, whose prospects, whose future has been constantly limited by the absence of a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is really what UNRWA is about. UNRWA has been made responsible for providing opportunities, I stress that word opportunities, through education, through health and preventive health, through economic assistance. And this is the core work of the agency. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure you're all familiar, but just to remind you, there's about half a million children, 500,000 children in our schools throughout the Middle East. This is more than most governments of small states would have in their own public schools or state schools. So it's quite a unique, or actually it is a completely unique undertaking, a unique project in the context of the United Nations. And it is a big responsibility, and a responsibility that is made more difficult to carry out by two things, which are in fact often related to each other. One is the recurrence and intensity of conflict in the Middle East, affecting the areas where Palestinian refugees live, and the other one is the lack of funding. Therefore, this effort that we make to give Palestinian refugees, and especially young refugees, opportunities for a better life in the absence of a solution to their plight, is constantly interfered with and set back by lack of resources, and particularly by the recurrence of conflict. Maybe a few minutes to describe the situation as it is now in respect of this population. I spoke about Syria. I think we should talk about that first. There's about 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria, and they have lived for over 60 years, since the late 40s, since when UNRWA was created. In fact, they've lived in relatively stable condition. They're not a very wealthy community in Syria, but certainly they have been given access to jobs over the years by the successive regimes, including the Assad regime, access to jobs, access to services. Fundamentally, they have been a supported community where UNRWA has always been able to work with relative ease. Now, since the beginning of the hostility, it has been our preoccupation, our and the Palestinian leadership occupation, the Palestinian Liberation Organization preoccupation, to continuously pass the message that Palestinians in Syria should be left out of this conflict. Their main desire is to remain neutral, not to take side, not to be involved. Palestinians have a difficult, challenging history of being in other people's conflict. Remember Lebanon, remember Jordan in the 70s, even the first Gulf War, when Arafat sided with Saddam, and this attracted huge hostility, especially in the Gulf. Palestinians, hundreds of thousands of them, were expelled from Kuwait. And I think that those hard lessons learned in history weigh in into this choice of neutrality that most Palestinians have made. The problem is that the conflict in Syria, that you all know much about and read much about, has become so widespread, so violent, so much present in everybody's life in Syria today that holding the Palestinians back from the conflict has become more and more challenging. Today, there are groups of Palestinians that are supporting the regime and fighting with the regime, and there are groups of Palestinians that have sided with the opposition and are fighting with the opposition. And unfortunately, and although not yet to a great extent, but to a certain extent, that protective neutrality layer is being torn up, and the Palestinians are being dragged into the conflict. The main difficult situation is occurring near Damascus, where most of the Palestinians live, especially in an area that you may have read about called Yarmouk. Yarmouk is a suburb of Damascus, a very strategic suburb. Who controls Yarmouk controls a good portion of Damascus, so the fighting has been particularly intense. The situation as we know it now is that around Yarmouk, the army is surrounding the area, and inside Yarmouk, up to 6 opposition groups are fighting against the government. This is another very worrying situation. The opposition, one has no sympathy for the Syrian regime, but what we see on the ground is a variety of opposition groups whose approaches and wishes and plans are not very clear and certainly worrying. One thinks also of the future. What will happen if the dispensation in Syria changes, the regime falls, and a new Syrian order, or rather disorder, succeeds the current situation? How will this situation be for the Palestinians? Will there be backlash against those that may have sympathized for the government? In a way, the Palestinians, although you can't classify them as a minority because they're refugees, they're not citizens of Syria like the Alawites or the Christians, but the preoccupation that we have is that there could be in the future some backlash against them. So something that we are already planning for and looking towards. Of course, we are worried about the immediate situation. We estimate that about half of the 500,000 people, Palestinian people, are displaced in Syria. They cannot go to Jordan. Jordan has issued a very stringent policy of no admission for Palestinian refugees from Syria, claiming that they're doing enough for Syrians coming, hundreds of thousands, and they have already given enough over the past 6 decades to Palestinians. There's about 2 million registered Palestinian refugees in Jordan. So the only way out of Syria is into Lebanon. 30,000 Palestinians have joined the almost 200,000 Syrians that have fled to Lebanon. The 30,000 Palestinians are a heavy burden for Lebanon. In Lebanon, as you know, the very sensitive balance between communities and religions makes any additional Palestinian presence more sensitive than in any other country. But Lebanon has no ways to stop the Palestinians from coming, and therefore has to take them in. And they just go into that country and complicate things further. And more important, perhaps, from the humanitarian point of view, live in appalling conditions in those camps that some of you may know that are already very tough and very difficult without this additional influx. The refusal of Jordan to take the Palestinians in is worrying and interesting in a way. It shows how sensitive the Palestinian presence is in Jordan as well. Jordan is probably of what we call the refugee hosting country, the most stable still, but its extreme concern about possible Palestinian arrivals shows how sensitive the issue has become even in Jordan, where perhaps half of the population is Palestinian. It's a demographic concern, it's a security concern, it's the concern that in the absence of a solution to the refugee question and with other refugee hosting countries in crisis, Jordan may become the only place where Palestinians go. And Jordan doesn't want that to happen. Jordan refuses, as you know, the equation between Jordan and Palestine. Jordan says, we are not Palestine. And I think that this is really the main reason for this otherwise rather worrying policy that prevents people fleeing legitimately from violence from crossing a border. A few words about West Bank and Gaza. No major change. You probably are familiar with the situation. I always like to say that one should not think that the blockade of Gaza has been eased in any significant way in spite of what you might read. I think that following 2010 and some liberalization of imports, which was extremely welcome, something which we have always said to the Israeli government was important and positive and has allowed us, for example, to do quite a lot of reconstruction work. But other than that, things have not fundamentally changed. One thing that I keep praising, we keep praising, and others keep praising, including the US government, with the Israeli government, is the importance of resuming exports. Without the resumption of exports across the blockade into the natural markets of Israel, of Gaza, which are Israel itself and the West Bank, the economy of Gaza cannot move out of the deep stagnation and depression in which it finds itself. It has found itself for the past few years. Obviously, the repeated conflicts, CAST-led Operation First, and then the recent spike last November don't help, and therefore worry us a lot because they set back the painfully progressive agenda of trying to stretch the blockade and opening up so that exports and imports can improve and exports can also be resumed. Of course, our position is the position of the UN. The blockade is illegal from the international legal point of view and should be lifted altogether. Now, we fully understand that this is easier said than done, and there's many complications and some legitimate security concerns on the part of Israel. We also believe, however, that a more stable and prosperous Gaza, not a Gaza in a way artificially kept into a state of underdevelopment, would be, from the security point of view, a more reliable neighbor for Israel than a Gaza that is kept under, in poverty, and a Gaza in which, by the way, Hamas gets reinforced by the blockade and by the measures that go with it, because it gives Hamas a space that most likely, in economic terms and even political terms, it wouldn't otherwise have. A few words on the West Bank, just to say that, in the West Bank, Palestinian refugees that number 750,000, so about a third of the population. In Gaza, they are 2/3 of the population. In the West Bank, they are fundamentally affected by the same problems as the rest of the Palestinian population, which is really the problems caused by the illegal settlement and the illegal settlement expansion and all that goes with it, and all the security enterprise that is built literally over the settlement to protect them, because that is what causes most of the problems of access, of movement, of poverty, you name it. And therefore, our advocacy in the West Bank has been very much in line with the rest of the international system to try and influence Israeli policies. Not very successful, I must say, in the last few years. I live in Jerusalem myself, in East Jerusalem, and I can tell you I live in one of the Arab quarters, and most of my neighbors over the years have become Israeli settlers and not anymore Palestinians. So this is actually quite an indication of how things are moving. Unfortunately, I think that I, like many others, think that this is perhaps the most detrimental or the biggest obstacles in the way to peace, and something that we see physically every day. A few final reflections. One is, and I'm really being quite quick so that we can have more time for questions. One is 4 or 5 points. First, I've been now almost 8 years working with UNRWA, and I observe that more and more the Palestinians get stuck. You know, if I have to describe, to use a word to describe the situation of Palestinians, they're stuck politically, but also physically. Look at the situation in Gaza, that's the biggest example, but also Syria today. That's the mode in which Palestinians find themselves when the situation goes into crisis. And I also always say that one of the biggest vulnerabilities of the Palestinians is the sensitivity with which they are perceived in the region. Look at the situation in Syria again. The Jordanians perceive any arrival of Palestinians as sensitive, therefore they shut them out, thereby leaving them in a situation of high risk and high danger. This sensitivity of the Palestinian presence is really one of their biggest vulnerabilities. That's why I argue all the time that although they're a small element of the Syria crisis, they're one that needs attention from international players. The second issue is that, of course, the incredibly, you've heard this for sure here in Washington very often, the accusation, the criticism, let's say, to UNRWA, that UNRWA is an agency that perpetuates a problem that could be solved otherwise by settling these people in the host countries, or ending their refugee status. Now, first of all, this is not something that UNRWA can decide by itself. We have a mandate from the General Assembly. It's only the General Assembly that can make these decisions. But putting UNRWA away would not solve the problem of refugees. You would still have the refugees with their unresolved claims and situations of different nature, but you would have those refugees deprived of education, deprived of those opportunities that UNRWA provides to them. So I would argue that even in very practical terms, UNRWA continues to be necessary, and even more so in a situation in which a political settlement, including a solution to the question of refugees, seems to be going away from us rather than towards us. There were more optimistic years in which the future of UNRWA, meaning closing the agency down in the 90s, was very much discussed. Many of you will remember that, and it was a reality that seemed to be close. But we've gone very far away from that situation. Unfortunately, UNRWA is very necessary because of the absence of that political situation. But that distancing from us of a solution is also creating a lot of disaffection, not just in respect of the refugee question, but in general, and especially among the young Palestinians in the region, something that I think we need to reflect about very seriously. Like all populations in the Middle East, the Palestinians have a youth bulge, so a lot of young people, and a lot of young people in poverty, with limited opportunity, stuck in many places without a political solution, is not a good recipe for the stability of the region. Talking of stability, I'm always advised by all my colleagues to say that UNRWA is an element for stability. This is a big thing to say in a region as unstable as the Middle East. But certainly, more modestly, I would say that that's something to be remembered. It's not just that we're needed by the refugees. I think that we are indeed a contributor to whatever stability still exists in the region. Educating children in particular, providing vocational training to a few thousand people. Our centers our centers have at any given time, our vocational training center, about 6,000 to 7,000 people who go out of our vocational training center and get jobs. In a region which has so much unemployment, this is not irrelevant. And we give jobs to 30,000 people. We employ, because we do all our work directly, not through governments or through NGOs. We do it directly. We employ the teachers, we employ the doctors, we employ the social workers. This is the bulk of our staff. And 30,000 people means that maybe 300,000 people benefit from the salaries that we pay. Now, this is not our reason, our raison d'etre, our reason for existing, but certainly it is an element. We are the biggest employers of Palestinians in the region after the Palestinian Authority. We are the second biggest employer overall in Jordan. So, you know, we are an entity that carries a weight also from the socio-economic point of view. The final point I want to make is linked to all this. Of course, we cost money. We cost about $1.2 billion a year to the international community. You know, the figures that you're hearing these days about the budget in the US make 1.2 billion sound like a very small drop in the ocean. But for a United Nations agency to raise all this money from voluntary contributions of governments is, believe me, our daily ordeal, and something that is not easy in a situation in which in Europe, for example, aid is slashed is because of their own economic situation. The same may happen here in the next few months. You know, a cut of 5 to 10% of US funding to UNRWA, and the US being the most important bilateral donor to the agency, and that has been appreciated very much, including by the Palestinians over the year. But a cut of 5 to 10% would be lethal to the functioning of the organization. And this is something that, of course, given the current situation here, I will have to raise in the next few days with the State Department. But in general, we are chronically underfunded, especially for our core activities of education and health. These are the most difficult activities to market to governments from voluntary funding in a situation of protracted crisis like the one that we are facing. So you would think that there would be an understanding that the more crisis there is in the region, the more needed UNRWA is. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way, and we struggle to exist, basically, and we struggle to continue to provide those opportunities that are really at the core of our work in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me ask the first question, and then we'll open it up to the group. You talked about the special difficulties of the Palestinian refugees coming from Syria into Lebanon. Two-part question: what are there Palestinians making their way to Turkey? And secondly, in Lebanon, where do they go? We have heard here that they are not part of the UNHCR camps within Lebanon, and that they have to kind of make it on their own in Lebanon. But what does that really mean?
Very few have gone to Turkey, to answer your first question, largely because Palestinians don't have relatives there, and also because the Palestinians that live in northern Syria are fewer than the ones that live closer to the Lebanese or Jordanian borders. So we don't work in Turkey. So UNHCR will take care of those going to Turkey, but we understand from UNHCR that, you know, they are in the dozens rather than in the hundreds. So very few of them. Those who declare themselves as being Palestinian, by the way, maybe some don't. As I said, the bulk goes to Lebanon. Most of them go to live with other Palestinians in the existing Palestinian camps. Lebanon has a regular, let's say, regular population of about, it's difficult to tell you, the Palestinians registered in Lebanon are about 450,000, but in reality, many of them have left to other countries. So we estimate, this is an estimate, that the normal population of Palestinians in Lebanon is about 300,000. And now you have this additional 30,000 so far, and more coming every day. They live with others. Some pay rent to other Palestinians to occupy part of their house. Some actually are hosted. I often tell this in a way nice but also heartbreaking story of a house in Shatila camp in Lebanon, which I visited just a few weeks ago, in which an old Palestinian refugee in Lebanon is hosting a family of Palestinians coming from Syria. And then I asked her, why do you host them? Because most of them charge. This one was not. She said, because when there was a civil war here in Lebanon, I went with my family to Syria, and this family hosted me. Now, this is, it makes you feel good, but behind this, there's a tragic story of multiple displacement. Remember that in both instances, these people were double refugees. They're already refugees from their homes, which is now Israel, and they become refugees again. So the situation is very, very difficult. The camps that I'm talking about, Shatila, Burj el Barajne, and other camps, especially in the Beirut belt, are awful places. Lebanon, because of the complex situation that I quickly alluded to, Lebanon has never allowed Palestinians to have proper access to jobs and services. They have to depend almost entirely on UNRWA assistance, which is limited. So the conditions to begin with are bad. And so additional people, 30,000 is not a small amount of people, small number of people, add to the extreme hardship in which Palestinians in general live in Lebanon. That's one of our main concerns now. Luckily, we've got funding to address that situation, because when there is a crisis, you get funding. It's when the crisis recedes from the screens, from the media, that of course, and that's our worry. What if these people don't go immediately back to Syria and stay there? And probably by the end of the Syria crisis, if there will be an end, there will be many more. That's what really worries us in the long term.
Please say your name and affiliation.
Thank you. Tom New, retired in the Washington area. Filippo, it used to be said that Syria was the least interfering with the Palestinian refugees. Perhaps that's changed, and you might want to comment on that. And secondly, how does UNRWA maintain proper relationships with the government of Syria at a time when it feels it has its own problems and it feels so besieged?
The history of Palestinians in Syria, irrespective of the history of Syria, is actually a stable history. I believe, this is perhaps a personal view, Syria, of the host countries for Palestinian refugees before this crisis, so before 2011, was probably the most confident. And the Palestinian presence was relatively small compared to the rest. It's not like in Jordan, where the Palestinians are almost a majority or a very large minority. In Syria, they were numerous, but compared to the 25 million people, they were small. So it never represented a threat. Plus, of course, successive regime, but in particular the Ba'athist regime since Assad's father, made of support to Palestinians a flag. They like to portray themselves as the champions of the Palestinian cause. So this combination of factors made that, resulted into a relatively benign situation. They could have, they never got citizenship or a special form of citizenship like they got in Jordan because of principles, but certainly they got, and even more, the other benefits of being, almost integrated in the society. Now, has this changed? I don't know. I made 2 visits to Syria last year only because of the situation. But in my second visit, which was at the end of the year, what I heard, especially from the young Palestinians, is that they felt for the first time discriminated. And the discrimination was not so much targeted, but, if there are few beds in a hospital because there's so many wounded people, the Palestinian would go to the back of the queue, and the Syrians would be, and same thing for the scarce jobs remaining in the country. So, of course, the vulnerability of a refugee population may not be visible in normal times, but when the crisis strikes, then it comes out very dramatically. And in terms of our relationship with the government, well, we know we must have a relationship with the government. Most of the Palestinians today in Syria are still living in areas controlled by the government, not by the opposition. And of course, the government knows that we, like any other UN agency or organization in the country, must have contacts with the opposition because some of our beneficiaries may be in areas controlled by them. The government understands and tolerates this, But most of our dealings have to continue to be with the government because they control the areas inhabited by Palestinians. They're not easy. You know, one strange thing that is happening in Syria today is that the Syrian government has always been a fairly bureaucratic government, you know, big, bloated bureaucracy, quite cumbersome to navigate. This situation has exasperated those characteristics. And in addition to other consideration of security and politics, the government has become slow to respond to our needs for, you know, customs clearance or importation of materials and goods and food and whatever you need to do to run the operation. So it's a big challenge. Of course, the most difficult part is security. You know, we have to make, you know, people must realize, and this is not just for UNRWA, but for all other, you know, humanitarian agencies operating in Syria today, the choices that we have to make every day are pretty dramatic. For example, think of schools. We have 118 schools in Syria. Every day, it's a nightmare of a decision to consider whether we should keep a certain school open or not because of insecurity. Kids want to go to school. Their parents want them to go to school. You know, there's many people in Lebanon that have fled because of the lack of education in Syria. I was reading today in the media that in Aleppo only 6% of the children altogether, including Palestinians, go to school. But how do you make a decision about, you know, we are the ones deciding if the schools are open or closed. What if you leave it open and then a shell lands on a school, which is not impossible, and you have 1,000 kids at risk? So, you know, this is the type of terrible dilemmas that we're facing in Syria today.
Hi, Chris Mancini with the Eurasia Center. You've talked a lot about Syria, and you've been dealing with the government and the opposition. Assuming that the Assad regime is replaced at some point and orders restored, what do you foresee for the Palestinians in this new scenario? I know it's hard to predict what there will be, but since you've dealt with both sides, have you heard anything, have any feelers out for how they would be treated and how the issue would be addressed?
I think it depends a lot on what happens after if and after the Assad regime goes. If it is a managed transition with relative political control, let's say, in which the international community has a role, then I think that there could be negotiation with whoever takes power afterwards to respect all the minorities. In fact, I think that this would be a precondition for the international community to support whichever government comes after the Assad regime. And this is not just Palestinians, but Christians, Alawites, Kurds, whatever. And I think that my point here would be only to remind everybody not to forget the Palestinians in whatever setup is organized. But unfortunately, what we fear and what most observers fear is that what comes after, if there is an after, you know, we're not there. What comes after is a messy situation in which different groups control different parts of the country. That's the real risk, because then you may have groups that become hostile to some of the existing ethnic groups or the refugees. There's not only Palestinian, there's also a lot of Iraqi refugees still in Syria, taken care of by UNHCR. So we are, you know, both organizations are quite worried about possible backlash, because these people may be seen as having been protected by the regime. You know, by the way, this is what happened in Iraq in 2003, when there was a regime change after Saddam went, and a more Shia government took over. The Palestinians that had been indeed very much protected by the Saddam regime became the target of horrifying attacks. And most in fact, left the country. So that's the fear. I think that in Syria it is less of a fear. For the Palestinians, they're Sunni, so they are presumably of the same group as those that will be in power in a post-Assad situation. And they have not been protected in the same way as the Saddam regime protected Palestinians in Iraq. And largely the assistance has been conveyed through UNRWA. But that's why it's so important that we establish contacts with opposition groups also to discuss what will be the situation in the future. The reality is that those that are likely to be in control of some parts are not interlocutors of anybody in the international community, and that's the challenge at the moment.
Art Hughes, Middle East Institute and the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Thank you very much. What is the nature of interaction with the government of Israel, and how would you characterize the government of Israel's attitude toward UNRWA now? Thank you.
I almost always give the same reply. It's a business-like relationship. You know, the government of Israel, I think, is one of the governments in the world, well, and understandably so, that appreciates the importance of UNRWA for a variety of reasons, especially in Gaza. You know, they appreciate that, you know, my argument about stability that I made earlier is very clear in the mind of our Israeli interlocutors, especially the military, but also, you know, diplomats and the foreign ministry people. Now, Israel has, of course, and from their perspective, one can perhaps understand, if not agree, but understand, they have a fundamental issue with the refugee question for the reasons that we know. That is separate from UNRWA. You know, we are not the ones to decide whether, as I said earlier, whether the refugee question should end or not. We've been given a mandate by the international community, and we carry it out. But Israel, of course, has an issue with that. Thinks, for example, that the refugees should not be considered refugees anymore after a number of generations. Okay, that debate belongs to the peace process and to the negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians. The problem occurs when the two discourses get mixed up together or joined together, and the argument the refugees should not be refugees anymore gets mixed up with UNRWA, and therefore UNRWA should stop assisting them. You know, this is an argument that has been raised here in Washington, has been raised in Israel and in many other places. And like I said, this is, in my opinion, a risky argument, because if we stopped assisting the Palestinians, it would be worse for everybody, including for Israel. Other than that, you know, the main interface with Israeli authorities is really on access, on permissions to import goods into Gaza. You know, every single gram of food or bag of cement that we import into Gaza, and we import quite a lot, has to be cleared with Israeli authorities. And that's quite a complex undertaking. We have to provide security guarantees for every project that we run in Gaza to avoid the possibility that materials that we import are used for purposes of, you know, hostile to Israel and so forth. So that's a constant negotiation. But like I said, that's very business-like. It's done usually at the technical level, and it's done in a manner that I would say works. You know, we have many issues with the slow responses, with some of their concerns which we don't agree, but you know, this is part of the daily discourse, I would say. Final point, what I think Israel often tells us, at least our interlocutors, is that we should simply carry out our work and be quiet. And I don't agree with that. I think that UNRWA has, as a fundamental part of its mandate, not only to provide assistance, but also to speak out on behalf of the rights of the Palestinian refugees. And we don't do this just in the occupied territory. We do this in Lebanon, for example, where we've been advocating for years for an extension of the labor rights or the property rights of refugees. So I think that's part of our job. It's not simply to feed or to educate, but also whenever there is a violation of human rights, to speak out. Now, the Israelis, and to an extent the US government, has an issue with this and think that this is not our task. Well, on this, I have always agreed to disagree with them.
Hi there, Uri Morantz. I'm interning here in DC. First of all, Mr. Grandi, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming here. It's a very interesting topic. I have a two-part question, but I'll be quick. Firstly, I'm curious about partnerships. Have you been approached, considering your experience decades long in the region with Palestinian refugees, have you been approached by regional governments, especially Lebanon and Jordan, as to how to deal with the Syrian refugee issue, or even local NGOs or companies in the region? And secondly, what kind of difficulties do you face and what kind of differences do you experience dealing with a PA government in the West Bank and a Hamas government in Gaza? Thank you.
I think on the first question is, I'm not sure I understand it fully, but it's relatively simple. You know, Syrian refugees, I mean not Palestinian refugees from Syria, Syrians, the majority, almost 1 million today in the region, are the responsibility of UNHCR. So they take care of them, and those governments will go to UNHCR to deal with that. They will come to us only for the Palestinians, and that's essentially only Lebanon. That's the only place where they're going, as I said. So that's one answer. On the second one, well, of course, our counterpart in the complex, to use a mild word, world of Palestinian institution is the PLO, is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO is the sole legitimate representative of all Palestinians internationally, in particular those living outside Palestine or the occupied territory. So they are politically representing, or should represent, the Palestinians. So we work with them on that. For example, today on the Syria crisis, we have close dealings with the PLO. We have asked them, for example, to intercede with neighboring countries. We have worked in their support in the appeals for the neutrality of Palestinian people and areas and structures in Syria to be respected. So that there, I think there's a good. Of course, you know, the PLO is in a very difficult moment because of the fragmentation of the leadership. So I won't say anything, I think, offensive to the PLO if I say that the current difficulties that they're experiencing nationally are reflecting themselves in a leadership of the Palestinian cause which is weakened. And this is very negative. UNRWA cannot substitute the PLO in that particular political role. And we've been very clear on that. But that's difficult. You know, there's a demand that we feel very strongly from the Palestinians in Lebanon, for example, that the PLO hasn't done quite enough to defend their rights. You know, I think this is slightly unfair. The PLO has tried, but of course they have their own limitations. But this is the kind of complex situation that we have at the moment. In terms of the fragmentation between Fatah and Hamas, this is a big problem. This is a big problem. Not, you know, in practical terms, we operate in parallel to the Palestinian Authority, not through the Palestinian Authority. So in a way, we will operate whoever is in charge of a particular area. But you can fully appreciate the difficulty of running huge health and education program with, you know, a coordination with the Ramallah authorities and a much more complicated interface with the authorities in Gaza, which are not recognized by most of the international community, including, you know, the quartet of which the United Nations is part. So that's a very difficult one in many, many ways. Now, I'm often asked the question, maybe I'll preempt, what's your relation, therefore, with Hamas on the ground? Well, again, can I use that word again? It is a business-like relation. Hamas needs UNRWA to be there and to provide services to 2/3 of the population of Gaza. So, you know, but of course there are some issues you may have seen or may not have seen, but I'll tell you now that we just had to cancel our long-planned marathon. You know, we run every year for the past 3 years a marathon in Gaza. Gaza is long exactly as the length of a marathon. And so, you know, we think that this is a great act of solidarity. You know, there are people coming to run that marathon. But this year, Hamas told us just a few days ago that women would not be allowed to run. And frankly, we don't think that then we should run it at all if women cannot run. Now, this is the type of, I would say, ideological, if that's the right word, ideological differences that we may have. I don't think they are, you know, catastrophic in the sense that we can keep the dialogue open, but that dialogue is made very difficult by the fact that, you know, politically we cannot have a relationship with Hamas as we have with other host countries because of the international politics, and therefore that fragmentation, the sooner it ends through a reconciliation process, the better. But as you probably know, you know, the prospects there seem to be very, very negative at the moment.
My name is Herbert Grossman. I'm a retired judge. In your negotiations with Hamas and Fatah or the PLO, do you accommodate them when it comes to education at all? I'm sure they insist on the type of propaganda they have in their own schools. Do you stay independent of that, or do you attempt to accommodate them?
By a fairly old convention, UNRWA has been using, I think from almost the outset of its history, has been using national curricula in its schools. National meaning the curricula of the country hosting that particular refugee. So in Jordan, we use the Jordanian curriculum. In the West Bank and Gaza up to 1994, UNRWA used a mixed, used the Jordanian curriculum in the West Bank because, like pre-67, that was part of Jordan. And in Gaza, it used the Egyptian curriculum because that was the original curriculum established in 1949. In 1994, when the Palestinian Authority came about and developed its own curriculum, UNRWA shifted to the Palestinian Authority curriculum. In fact, as you know, I think that to say that the Palestinian curriculum is inflammatory or contains propaganda elements, I would not go that far. First of all, it has been developed with a lot of support by the international community that has been able to influence that curriculum considerably. And a lot of, of the inherited anti-Israel materials has been purged by the curriculum over the years. This, if you read analysis of the curriculum that have been carried out, especially the State Department over the years, it shows the evolution in that sense, the positive evolution. Of course, the curriculum in Jordan, in all these countries, is a curriculum that is founded on a narrative. That's the Arab narrative. That's not the Israeli narrative, just like the Israeli curriculum is founded on the Israeli narrative. So, of course, some may see that narrative as a, propaganda, as you said. So we follow that. Now, in addition to that, and that's quite important, since about 12 years ago, we have been allowed by all the authorities in the region, including the PA, to introduce what we call an enrichment to the curriculum, which is in fact a substantive addition to the curriculum, which teaches human rights. And through that, we've been able to inject in the curriculum in our schools, this doesn't happen in state schools, a large amount of teaching on tolerance, coexistence, etc., etc. Now, it's a constant battle to expand that curriculum and make it more and more effective in conveying these values to the Palestinian refugee children. But, evolution is occurring, and I think that that's the way to go. So it's a rather complex answer to an important question, but, we're working daily on that particular issue.
I'm Phil Wilcox, the Foundation for Middle East Peace and American Friends for UNRWA. Commissioner-General Grandi, you mentioned the authorization the Israelis have given to imports of building supplies and material for UNRWA's reconstruction programs. Do the security arrangements that are used to protect that traffic from smuggling, are they available, and could they be readily expanded to accommodate normal imports and exports between the authorities under the control of the authorities in Gaza and Israel, or would an entirely new inspection regime have to be created?
I think from the practical point of view, the answer is yes, quite easily. I mean, if we as a UN agency can offer sufficient guarantees to the State of Israel that what we do is not offensive in military terms, I think that it could be expanded quite easily. Frankly, Phil, I think that, unfortunately, to be realistic, I think until there is an accommodation between Hamas and Fatah and reconciliation, it will be very difficult for Israel in particular to accept that security arrangement, as other than enforced by the United Nations, can be accepted as as viable for them and trustworthy. I don't think it will happen. Now, of course, Israel is not the biggest fan of reconciliation and accommodation, but that's another matter. So, you have there a rather vicious circle, but that's a political issue that I won't go into. But I think that from the practical point of view, certainly Gaza is a very easy place to control if there is the right context and resources and will to do it. The problem is that none of these things exist at the moment.
Thank you very much. Sado Qol, UNHCR. I'm reminded of the book by Samantha Power, Chasing the Flame. You should do it more often. You should come to Washington, D.C. more often and advocate for the Palestinian refugees. My question is about how dire is the situation of UNRWA in terms of finance at this stage, and the recent conference, donors conference in Kuwait. Did that affect positively UNRWA?
Well, thanks for the first part of your remarks. I'm honored, but not sure so well deserved. On the second part, yeah, I was in Kuwait, so was your High Commissioner, and what can I say? The pledges were colossal, but I'm not so sure they're real. Sorry, to be very honest. We haven't seen, the US pledge or the EU pledge, I think, are pretty firm. They're the result of a legislative process. They have to be delivered, and they will be, of course. We're already counting them in us, and we benefit from that as well. There was a clear appreciation for the importance of the Palestinian dimension, and your High Commissioner was very good in stressing that although that's not his responsibility, UNRWA had to be supported, and he's done it in the Security Council and elsewhere. So I'm really, as he knows, I'm very appreciative of that. The problem of the Kuwait pledges are the pledges from some of the Gulf countries because, now a month and a bit after the conference, we're still not sure where this money is going or whether it's coming at all. That's because, of course, the structure of aid in Gulf countries is very different from Western countries. I'm not suggesting for a moment that is less important or less useful. On the contrary, no, we benefit from huge financial support from Saudi Arabia in Gaza, for example, especially in the reconstruction of demolished houses or in the construction of additional schools to accommodate extra students. So, when it works, it's very, very effective. But unfortunately, the type of aid that is announced in these big conferences is difficult to translate into concrete pledges for concrete activities. But this is something that the UN as a whole at the moment is working on.
I've made a little bit of an error. I have not invited the considerable number of people who are in the overflow room to also provide questions. I do have one that was just passed to me, and this may be our second to last question, and that is, what are your views on what the United States should do in terms of getting actively involved in resolving the situation in Syria?
Who asked this question? Well, what can I say? I think of course, it's not just the United States. I think Mr. Brahimi spoke for all of us in the UN, the special envoy, when he said that, it is important that the Americans and the Russians get to an agreement on what pressures to put where, because that's the fundamental question at the moment. We are probably, sorry, I'm straying away from my mandate here, but we are probably already, I'm afraid to say, past the moment in which the worst can be avoided. Because an initial, very legitimate, very important movement of pressure on the Assad regime to obtain more liberties, more social justice, less corruption, that momentum, which was the momentum to be supported and to be encouraged in both ways, encouragement to them and pressure on the regime, has gone. Now the anti-Assad movement is composed, as I said many times, by a very large amount of groups. some of whom have an agenda that I don't wish it will win in that particular part of the Middle East. It will be very catastrophic. And I think that, of course, the situation as we see it now is no prevalence by anybody. So more fragmentation and civil war, even if the regime goes. So I think that, I don't know, one always say the window is narrow and narrow. I don't know if it is still there, but it is important to find an accommodation which is political and not military. That's very clear to me, and it is very important. Now, I understand that because, it's a vicious circle, the frustration, the absence of such an agreement between the major powers to put unified pressure on the parties, the failure to do that creates more space for all the rest. And at the moment, the choices that are being made are more dramatic in a way, are whether rebels should be armed or not. These are very, very sensitive issues because, like I said, we see it on the ground. We talk to civilians that every day are confronted with these opposition groups. They're very afraid of many of them. And most of the civilians we talk to have no sympathy whatsoever for the regime. In the initial phase of the unrest in February, March, April 2011, most of the ordinary civilians in Syria were very happy about what was happening and hopeful that there could be an evolution more similar to Egypt or to Yemen, to other places where, unrest happened, but in the end, a political accommodation was sought. They are very worried about the military option. On the other hand, if we continue to go on in the absence of a political accommodation, the military option will be the only one left on the table. The choices will be very difficult, and I think the post-Assad will be very dramatic. So that's what I can say.
Is there a final question from the overflow room? Okay, well, thank you. Please join me in thanking Mr. Filippo Grandi for...
Thank you.